The rain in Seoul did not fall. It hammered against the concrete, turning the subway station entrance into a gray, shimmering curtain. Alisha stood under the narrow metal overhang, watching the neon signs bleed into the wet asphalt. Every gust of wind sprayed moisture against her skin, making the air heavy and cold. She shifted, trying to find a dry patch of pavement, but the downpour was relentless. She did not hear him approach. The noise of the city, the screech of tires on slick stone, the distant hum of traffic swallowed any sound of footsteps. Then, the drumming on her head stopped. She looked up. A dark canopy blocked the sky. Minho stood inches away, his arm extended, holding the umbrella perfectly level. His breathing was slow, measured, and rhythmic. Please, don't forget to kindly subscribe to this channel for more stories. Get first to know. Entirely out of sync with the frantic pace of the street, he did not speak. He did not offer a greeting. He simply held the umbrella, his gaze fixed on the crowd flowing past them. His posture was static, a statue carved out of the humid night air. He moved the handle an inch to the left, shielding her from a stray gust. His motion fluid and practiced, as if he had calculated the exact trajectory of every raindrop. Alisha looked at the canopy above. Not a single droplet touched her hair. The rain continued to lash the pavement just inches beyond the umbrella edge, creating a sharp, wet perimeter. She had never said a word about her hair. She had never complained about the moisture or the humidity. Yet he had arrived with the shield ready before the storm had even begun to break. It was as if he had been tracking the weather patterns or her own unspoken frustrations from a distance. She turned to look at him. His expression remained neutral, focused entirely on the path ahead. There was no sign of effort in his grip, no muscle tension in his arm. Even as the wind picked up, he kept the umbrella angled with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. She tried to step forward, to break the rhythm he had established, but he adjusted his pace instantly to match her stride. It felt like walking inside a pre-programmed loop. Every movement he made served a purpose, and every purpose seemed tailored to her comfort. The realization settled in her chest like lead. He was not just attentive, he was anticipating needs she had not yet acknowledged herself. The city lights blurred around them, but under the umbrella, the world felt static, curated, and entirely, impossibly perfect. The neon signs of Seoul fractured across the wet pavement, turning the street into a shifting mosaic of red and electric blue. Alisha watched the light dance in the puddles, her own reflection distorted by the ripples of falling rain. Around them, the city pulsed with chaotic energy. Taxis cut through the standing water, and crowds surged toward the subway entrance with frantic urgency. Yet, standing beside her, Minho remained an island of stillness. She looked at his hand on the umbrella handle. It did not tremble. It did not shift. He seemed to exist in a different frequency than the rest of the world, his presence anchoring her to a space that felt increasingly artificial. She tried to catch his eye, to find some flicker of genuine human fatigue or distraction, but he continued to scan the street with that same unflinching, focused intensity. The vibrant colors of the market stalls nearby clashed with the gray, heavy sky, creating a sensory overload that made her head spin. She felt a sudden, sharp urge to pull away, to break the rhythm of his perfect, calculated grace. The city hummed with 1,000 different lives, yet in the space between them, the air felt thin, pressurized, and unnervingly quiet. She gripped her own elbows, the cold dampness of the night finally seeping through her skin, reminding her that she was standing next to a stranger who knew exactly how to stand. The cafe was a pocket of silence away from the relentless Seoul rain. Steam rose from 2 porcelain cups, curling into the dim, warm light. Alisha sat motionless, watching the condensation bead on the window pane. Before she could reach for the sugar, Minho slid a small, white packet across the polished wood toward her hand. He did not look up from his own drink. He did not wait for a request. He simply knew she took exactly 2 drops of vanilla. It was a small, precise action, yet it struck her like a cold draft in a sealed room. She watched his fingers retreat, steady and deliberate, returning to rest on the table with rhythmic patience. She had never spoken of her coffee preferences in his presence, She had never voiced that particular habit to anyone in this city. She held her breath, testing the silence, waiting for him to offer a comment or a smile. He remained quiet, his focus entirely on the steam lifting from his cup. The familiarity of the gesture felt alien. It was too smooth, too rehearsed, as if he were reading from a script he had memorized long before they ever met. She looked at the sugar packet, then at his profile, feeling the weight of an intimacy that felt less like love and more like an observation report. The silence in the cafe deepened until the only sound was the muffled rhythm of rain against the glass. Alisha stared into her cup, her thoughts circling the impossible precision of his actions. Then, a sound cut through the stillness, a low, rhythmic hum. It was a melody she had never sung aloud, a tune she reserved for the deepest hours of the night when the apartment was empty and she felt truly alone. She froze, her pulse jumping against her throat. The notes were perfect, matching the exact cadence she used when her mind drifted to memories of home. She looked up. Minho was staring at the window, his expression neutral, his lips tracing the familiar, haunting sequence of notes with haunting ease. The sound felt like a physical touch, a cold finger tracing the map of her private soul. She felt exposed, stripped of the one sanctuary she thought remained entirely hers. She pulled her hands beneath the table, clutching her elbows until her knuckles turned white. He did not look at her, yet the humming continued, steady and unbothered. Each note felt like a violation, a key turning in a lock she had never shared with another living person. She was no longer just being watched, she was being decoded. The melody ended as abruptly as it began, leaving a vacuum of sound that made her ears ring. Alisha watched him, waiting for the flicker of confusion, the slight hesitation of a man caught in a private moment. It never came. Minho turned his head, his smile surfacing with the exact, measured warmth he had shown on their first day. It was a mechanical grace, a performance that never required a second take. She leaned forward, deciding to break the sequence. "Why that song?" she asked, her voice sharp. "It was just a random thought," he replied, his tone as flat and even as a pre-recorded announcement. He did not blink. He did not frown. He simply reached for his cup, his movements fluid and efficient, showing no sign of the human clumsiness that defined everyone else she knew. She realized then that he never stumbled, he never fumbled a word, he never had a bad day. Every gesture was a calculated response, a mirror designed to reflect only what she wanted to see. The perfection was not a trait, it was a barrier. She stared at his hands, steady and still, and felt the chilling realization that she was not living with a partner, but with a mirror that had been carefully polished to hide the emptiness behind the glass. The night market hummed with life, a chaotic symphony of sizzling oil and shouting vendors that usually provided a sense of anonymity. Alisha moved through the dense crowd, her hand loosely held in Minho's grip. She focused on the steam rising from the stalls, trying to ground herself in the noise. Then, a man rushing past collided with them, stumbling backward into a pile of wooden crates. He regained his balance and looked up, his gaze fixing on Minho. The change in the man was instantaneous. Every muscle in his face went rigid, his jaw dropped, and his eyes widened until the whites were visible in the low light. He did not apologize. He did not look at the crates he had knocked over. He simply backed away, his breath hitching, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror escaping his throat. He turned on his heels and vanished into the darkness of a side alley, shoving past people to escape. Alisha felt the grip on her hand tighten. She looked at Minho, but he was staring at the space where the man had stood, his face as smooth and unreadable as a calm lake. The vibrant energy of the market felt suddenly thin, like a veil pulled back to reveal something jagged and dangerous underneath. She pulled her hand back, the air between them turning ice cold. The crowd swallowed the stranger, closing the gap like water over a stone, but the man's expression of raw panic lingered in Alisha's mind. She turned toward Minho, expecting a comment, a shrug, or even a flicker of annoyance at the interruption. There was nothing. He stood amidst the swirling noise of the market as if he were encased in glass. He did not watch the man flee. He did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his breathing steady, his posture entirely unchanged by the violent collision. A cold shiver crawled up her spine, sharp and distinct, cutting through the humid heat of the night stalls. She looked at his profile, searching for the man she thought she knew, but the sharp lines of his face seemed to belong to a stranger. What kind of person inspires that level of terror in a complete outsider? She took a half step back, putting distance between them, though the market stall owners continued to shout their prices as if the world were still normal. It was not normal. The silence radiating from him was heavier than the noise of the market. She realized then that she had been looking at a mask for months, and for the first time, she was truly afraid of what might be underneath it. Alisha stopped walking, forcing him to turn back toward her. The noise of the market surged around them, but she focused entirely on the space between them. She asked him about his childhood, about the years before he moved to this city, about the people who had raised him. She watched his mouth. She watched his eyes. Minho began to speak, his voice a steady, melodic stream of information. He recounted details of a life in a provincial town, describing the layout of a house and the color of a garden gate with total clarity. He did not blink. He did not search for a word. He did not pause to recall a memory. Every sentence landed with the exact weight of the one before it, precise and unbroken. It was a performance, delivered with the mechanical rhythm of a teleprompter script scrolling behind his eyes. She pressed him, dropping a question about a specific winter, hoping to catch a hesitation, a slip, a stutter. He did not stumble. He adjusted his stance, tilted his head, and continued his narrative without losing a single beat of his pacing. He was not remembering his past. He was reciting a file, perfectly indexed and ready for retrieval. The disconnect widened, turning into a chasm she could not bridge. They walked home in a silence that felt heavy enough to bruise. Alisha kept her gaze fixed on the wet pavement, avoiding the reflection of his face in the shop windows. Back in the apartment, the familiar hum of the refrigerator seemed to turn into an abrasive, mechanical grind. She went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water, her hands trembling just enough to make the glass clink against the faucet. He stood in the doorway, watching her with that same consistent, unblinking focus. She felt his attention on her neck, a steady pressure that never wavered. She turned to look at him, hoping for a sign of frustration, a flicker of anger, or even a tired sigh. There was nothing. He remained a statue in the dim light, his posture perfect, his breathing rhythmic. Every second that ticked by without a spontaneous word from him felt like a rejection of her humanity. She was living with a mirror that only reflected what she wanted to see, but the surface had begun to crack. She realized then that she was a stranger in her own home, trapped in a quiet room with a man who could not feel the weight of the air between them. The isolation was absolute. The door clicked shut, leaving a silence that vibrated in the floorboards. Alisha stood in the center of the living room, her breath hitching as she listened to his footsteps retreat down the hallway and fade into the hum of the city below. He was gone. The air in the apartment felt different, purged of his constant, watchful presence. She walked to the window and watched his figure emerge onto the street, his pace steady and purposeful, never once glancing back at the building. A cold spike of adrenaline surged through her chest. She had spent months pretending the gaps in his story were just personality quirks, but the fear was now a physical weight in her stomach. She could not live another day in the dark. Every object in the room suddenly felt like a lie. She turned toward the bedroom, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had decided she would tear the mask off this life, regardless of what lay beneath. Her hands brushed against the doorframe, steadying herself. She moved toward the closet, pushing aside the weight of her own hesitation. The time for questions had ended. The time for discovery had begun. Alisha stepped into the main living space, her boots silent on the hardwood. The apartment was a study in aggressive minimalism. Every surface was wiped clean, devoid of dust or the random clutter of a human life. She walked to the central table, where two coasters sat perfectly parallel to the edge of the wood, equidistant from the center. She shifted one an inch to the left, testing for life, but the space felt stagnant. The air held no scent, no cooking, no lingering perfume, not even the faint smell of old books. It was as if the room were waiting for a command to exist. She moved to the bookshelf, running a finger along the spines. They were arranged by height, then by color, creating a gradient that felt more like a display than a collection. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that clashed with the absolute stillness of the room. She felt watched, not by a person, but by the walls themselves. Every object was a calculated choice, a note in a symphony of control. She realized then that she was not standing in a home, but in a carefully constructed stage. The perfection of the space offered no comfort. It was a warning. She stood in the center of the room, breathing shallowly, waiting for the floorboards to creak, certain that the order she saw was hiding a jagged, broken truth. She did not wait for the room to stop feeling like a trap. She lunged for the writing desk, yanking the first drawer open with a sharp, ragged sound. It was empty, save for a single, pristine pen placed at a perfect 90-degree angle. She shoved it shut and pulled the next. Nothing. No receipts, no scraps of paper, no history. She moved to the dresser, her movements becoming wilder, less precise. She swept her hands through the contents of the top drawer, scattering organized stacks of paper that held no information, only blank pages. The steady, mechanical ticking of the wall clock echoed in the silence, growing louder with every passing second. It was a countdown. Every beat felt like a warning that her time was vanishing. Her hands shook as she tore through the remaining drawers, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She checked the shelves, sweeping her palm across the wood, searching for hidden compartments or recessed latches. The air in the room felt thinner, suffocating her. She abandoned the furniture and turned toward the dark interior of the closet, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had to find something before he walked back through that front door. The closet smelled of cedar and stale air, a sharp contrast to the sterile living room. She pressed her back against the hanging garments, her eyes scanning the shadows on the floor. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing over the seams of the wood. One board near the rear wall sat a fraction of a millimeter higher than the rest. She knelt, her knees hitting the hard floor, and jammed her fingernails into the narrow gap. It did not move. She shifted her grip, using the edge of a heavy shoe to wedge underneath the wood. The floorboard groaned, resisting her, but she threw her weight against it until the wood cracked and tilted upward. Dust billowed out from the dark void beneath, stinging her eyes. She coughed, forcing herself to stay low, and reached into the hollow space. Her fingertips brushed against something cool and textured, hidden in the pitch-black cavity. She pulled the object toward the light, her chest tightening as the shadow of the floorboards gave way to reveal the hidden stash. She gripped the item, the weight of it grounding her, and braced for what she might find inside. She hauled the object into the narrow beam of her flashlight. It was a thick leather binder, the surface cold and slightly damp from the stagnant air beneath the floor. She used her thumb to wipe away a layer of fine, gray dust, feeling the rough grain of the hide beneath her skin. The material felt heavy, substantial, as if it were packed with years of accumulated weight. She turned the binder over, her fingers tracing the embossed edges of the spine. There, centered on the front cover in bold, black lettering, was her own name, Alisha Andrew. The sight of it froze her breath in her throat. It was not a label, not a tag, but a name written with deliberate, clinical precision. A wave of pure, icy dread washed through her, starting at the base of her neck and settling deep in her stomach. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the sound deafening in the confined space of the closet. She stared at the letters, unable to look away, as the reality of the situation began to solidify. This was not a misplaced document. It was a collection, a record, and it belonged to her. Her name stared back from the dark, a silent confirmation that her life had been tracked, mapped, and cataloged long before she ever arrived in this city. Her hands trembled as she pried the metal rings of the binder open. The first page flipped back, revealing a high-resolution, glossy photograph. She gasped, the sound sharp in the quiet closet. It was a picture of her at a street market in Johannesburg, taken from a distance, hidden behind a fruit stall. She turned the page. Another photo. This one from a rainy afternoon outside her old apartment building. She flipped faster, the pages rustling like dry leaves. Every image was a timestamp from a life she thought was left behind. a cafe in Rosebank, a park bench in her old neighborhood. Years of her existence captured by a camera lens she never saw. The clarity of the images was surgical. She saw herself laughing, crying, and walking alone, all documented with cold, mechanical detachment. The realization hit her with the force of a physical impact, leaving her breathless. This was not a coincidence. This was a chronicle of her movements, dating back half a decade. She had been watched, tracked, and studied in her home country long before she ever set foot on a plane to Seoul. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her as the truth settled in her veins. She had never been anonymous. Beneath the photographs lay pages of handwritten notes. Alisha leaned closer, her eyes scanning the neat, slanted script. Subject prefers 2 drops of vanilla in coffee. Agitation levels rise if ignored. She scrolled down to the next entry. She hums jazz melodies when lonely. Use this to induce comfort during transition phases. Her throat tightened. She remembered humming those exact tunes in the dark, thinking she was alone. The notes continued, mapping her reactions like a weather chart. Sirens trigger immediate flight response. Keep distance during auditory exposure. She dropped the page, her hand shaking. These were not observations of a lover. They were instructions for a handler. Every quirk, every hidden vulnerability, every small preference she held dear had been dissected and cataloged. She looked at the words on the paper, seeing them not as descriptions, but as commands. She was being managed, her entire existence. From the way she took her morning drink to the way she processed grief, had been stripped of its meaning and reduced to a set of cold, actionable data points. She was a project, a sequence of inputs and outputs designed to be manipulated with surgical precision. Her gaze drifted to the bottom of the page, where the ink grew darker, pressed hard into the paper. A single line stood out, underlined twice in red. Do not mention her father. The air in the closet felt suddenly thin. She stared at the name she had buried years ago, a name she had never spoken aloud in Korea. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. The dossier did not just track her habits, it held the weapon that could shatter her. She felt the paper crinkle under her grip as her fingers tightened until the knuckles turned white. It was not just a note. It was a boundary line drawn around her most private wound. A sob caught in her throat, but she choked it back, replacing the grief with a sharp, burning resentment. They knew. They had taken the most painful memory of her life and turned it into a tactical constraint. She dropped the binder, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as she scrambled backward. The room blurred around her, the walls pressing in with the weight of this betrayal. Every secret she held had been picked clean, leaving her exposed and raw in the center of a trap she had mistaken for a home. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of her discovery. She was still on the floor, the binder splayed open before her, when the sound cut through the air. A crisp, mechanical click. The front door. She froze, her pulse thumping in her ears. She did not stand. She could not. The door swung inward on silent hinges. Minho stepped into the entryway, his movements as fluid and controlled as they had been on the day they first met. But the atmosphere shifted the moment he crossed the threshold. He did not look for her immediately. He closed the door, locked it, and placed his keys on the small table by the wall. Then he turned. The gentle, practiced smile she had known for months was gone. His face was a blank slate, devoid of any recognition or affection. He looked at her, but his eyes were not seeing a partner. They were scanning a variable. He stood tall, his posture perfectly rigid, his gaze cold and analytical. He was measuring her reaction, calculating the distance between them, and waiting for her to speak. The warmth had been a mask, and now, with the mask discarded, only the machine remained. Minho raised his right hand. A small black notebook rested against his palm, its edges worn from constant use. He did not step forward. He stood his ground, observing her with the detachment of a scientist watching a specimen. "I am not who you think I am," he said, his voice flat, stripped of the melodic cadence she had once found comforting. He tapped the cover of the notebook. "I was never your partner. I am a student. This was my final exam," he He took a measured step into the room, his eyes scanning her face as if checking for a specific, predicted response. Every preference, every hummed melody, every moment of supposed intimacy was a calculated maneuver. He recited the words like a lesson learned by rote. I was instructed by a professor from your past. He designed every interaction to mirror your deepest needs, to build this illusion until you were entirely dependent on the construct. He looked down at the notebook, then back at her, his expression entirely devoid of remorse. You were the subject, and I was the instrument. The training was thorough, Alisha. I was never meant to love you. I was only meant to keep you here. Alisha scrambled backward, her heels catching on the edge of the rug. Every word he spoke landed like a hammer blow against the glass wall of her reality. She needed to put distance between them, to escape the clinical precision of his gaze. As she lunged toward the door, her arms swung wide, slamming into the heavy brass lamp beside the desk. It tipped, tilted, and struck the floor with a violent, metallic crash that shattered the bulb and sent a spray of glass across the room. The sudden darkness was absolute, save for the flickering neon glare bleeding in from the street outside. She didn't stop to look back. The sound of the glass breaking echoed the final snapping of her heart. She stared at him, at the man who was nothing more than a carefully crafted construct, a hollow shell designed to mimic the person she had once trusted. The air in the apartment felt thin, suffocating, and charged with the static of a lie exposed. She was no longer a partner. She was a target in an experiment she never signed up for. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch toward her, and for the first time, she saw the apartment for what it truly was. A cage. Min-ho did not move toward her. He remained in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. You feel sick because the data is conflicting, he said, his tone as steady as a heartbeat monitor. But look at the evidence, he pointed to the leather binder on the floor. Every smile I gave you was a response to a trigger. Every cup of coffee, every gentle touch, every quiet word. It was all programmed to maximize your emotional attachment. Alisha felt a sharp, burning bile rise in her throat. She looked at him and saw not a man, but an algorithm wearing a human face. The memories of their late-night talks, the laughter in the market, the way he held her hand, they were not moments of love. They were successful simulations. She had been living in a curated reality, a play written by a ghost from her past, performed by a puppet that never knew a single genuine emotion. Each detail he revealed made her skin crawl. The intimacy she had cherished was nothing but a masterfully executed script. She pressed her palms against her ears, trying to block out the hollow, logical sound of his voice. Her heart, once full of warmth for him, now felt like a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The truth was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs until she could barely stand. Alisha retreated to the balcony, the sliding glass door vibrating under her touch. Outside, the Seoul skyline erupted in a frantic, pulsating rhythm of neon. Thousands of lights flickered in the distance, a sprawling grid of color that blurred into long, distorted streaks against the damp night air. She looked down at the streets far below, realizing the apartment was nothing more than a glass box suspended in a wider, mechanical web. The city was a cage, and she had spent months believing it was her sanctuary. The realization hit her with the cold clarity of winter wind. Her perfect life was a precisely engineered script, a sequence of triggers and responses designed to keep her contained. She gripped the cold metal railing, her knuckles turning white. She watched the traffic flow like blood through veins of asphalt, seeing the pattern of her own relationship reflected in the mechanical movement of the cars. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining cycle of observation and imitation. She exhaled, the mist of her breath vanishing instantly into the dark. The spell was not broken by a shout, but by the quiet, absolute refusal to believe the illusion any longer. She stood at the edge of the abyss, the city lights no longer looking like a guiding glow, but like the bars of a vast, illuminated prison. Alisha turned back. Min-ho still occupied the doorway, a fixed point of artificial calm. She did not speak. There was no negotiation left to hold. She lunged forward, slamming her shoulder into his chest. He staggered back, his composure finally fracturing as he stumbled against the doorframe. The leather binder slid from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. She stepped over it without a glance, ignoring the notebook he still clutched in his hand. Her boots hit the hallway tiles with a sharp, echoing snap. She reached the door and pulled the heavy latch downward. The mechanism clicked, a sound of release that vibrated through her palm. She stepped out into the stairwell. The air here was different, cold, unfiltered, and smelling of damp concrete and city exhaust. It bit at her skin, a sharp, stinging sensation that felt entirely real. She did not look back at the open apartment door. She did not look at the man who had been her reflection. She gripped the metal handrail, felt the biting chill of the steel, and began to descend into the dark, leaving the quiet, fabricated warmth of the room behind her for good. Alisha hit the sidewalk. The ground was slick with oil and rain, reflecting the neon signs in jagged, fractured light. She moved quickly, weaving through the late-night crowd near the station. People brushed past her shoulders, bumping, voices murmuring in a language that felt like background noise rather than a script she had to follow. She kept her head down, feet moving in a steady, rhythmic stride. Every step away from the building felt like shedding weight. She passed a street food stall, the scent of searing meat and garlic rising in thick, wet clouds. She did not stop. She did not look back to see if she was followed. She reached the main intersection, waiting as the crossing light flickered from red to green. The crowd surged forward, and she moved with them, a single, independent pulse in a sea of thousands. No one knew her name. No one knew her history. No one had notes on her fears or her favorite songs. She walked into the dark, rain-misted heart of the city, leaving the curated comfort of the past behind. She was finally breathing air that no one else had measured, choosing the cold, biting uncertainty of the streets over the suffocating safety of a lie. Applause. Don't forget to kindly subscribe to this channel for more stories. Get first as they dropped.